Ethan Carter's sprawling ranch had been in his family for generations, a living legacy of hard work, independence, and pride. Nestled among golden fields and dotted with weathered barns, the ranch wasn't just a piece of property. It was Ethan's sanctuary, a place where memories of his grandfather's calloused hands and his father's unwavering determination intertwined with the rhythms of nature. Every morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, Ethan would rise with purpose, checking on his cattle, tending to his crops, and ensuring that the land continued to yield its bounty for both sustenance and profit. A former military man turned full-time rancher, Ethan embodied the grit and resilience that defined rural America. His days were long and hard, spent plowing fields, repairing fences, and harvesting the fruits of the land. Among his prized possessions were his healthy, flourishing crops, corn, wheat, and a variety of vegetables that he nurtured with an almost sacred care. These crops weren't merely commodities. They were the tangible evidence of a legacy built on sweat and sacrifice. Every stalk, every ear of corn, and every row of vegetables told a story of perseverance and deep-rooted tradition. Yet over the past several months, a dark cloud had begun to loom over Ethan's cherished ranch. Rumors of overzealous interference had been swirling through the community. Whispers of an HOA that prided itself on enforcing an unrealistic standard of perfection. At the center of these whispers was one name, Kerren Miller. Kerren, the self-proclaimed queen of the local homeowners association, was a study in contrasts to Ethan's rugged authenticity. Always impeccably dressed in sharply tailored skirts and polished shoes, and never without her clipboard, she prowled the neighborhood like a miniature bureaucrat. To Kerren, every property, even one as time-honored and authentic as Ethan's ranch, had to conform to her exacting standards. In her mind, rustic charm was no excuse for what she considered disorderly or unkempt appearances. The spark that set the conflict ablaze came on a blistering summer afternoon. Ethan was in the midst of inspecting his fields and admiring the healthy green rows of crops when he noticed an unusual commotion near the perimeter of his property. A small group of impeccably dressed individuals had gathered in his cornfield, and at the center of it all stood Kerren, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the landscape with an air of self-importance. "Ethan," Kerren called out in a tone that brooked no argument, "I'm here to ensure that your property adheres to our community standards. Your current state, untamed and unsightly, is a violation of our guidelines." Ethan, wiping the sweat from his brow, strode over with measured determination. "Kerren, my ranch is my home. These crops have been cultivated with care and are the backbone of my livelihood. I don't need your meddling," he replied, his voice calm yet firm. Kerren's lips curled into a dismissive smile as she held up a freshly printed final warning notice. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she said coolly. "Your property must conform to the approved standards. If you refuse, further action will be taken." A hush fell over the gathered onlookers, neighbors who had peered over fences and from behind barn doors, shocked to see such a confrontation on their doorstep. For Ethan, this was more than just a bureaucratic spat. It was a direct challenge to his right to manage his own land according to traditions passed down through generations. Standing amid the familiar landscape, where every furrow held the memories of his forefathers, Ethan felt a surge of defiance. He knew that Kerren's intrusion was not merely about aesthetics. It was about control. The HOA, under her leadership, was determined to impose its will on every property, regardless of history or individuality. And Ethan was not about to let his legacy be trampled by an overreaching bureaucrat. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan retreated to his porch with a warning notice clutched tightly in his hand. In the quiet of the evening, he made a silent vow. He would fight for every inch of his ranch, for every crop he'd nurtured, and for the freedom to live by his own rules. Kerren's words had lit a fire within him, a fire that would soon burn as fiercely as his adversaries' misplaced ambitions. The morning after that heated confrontation, Ethan awoke to a grim surprise. Taped to the weathered door of his ranch office was an envelope bearing the unmistakable seal of the HOA. With trepidation and indignation, He tore it open. Inside lay a fine of $750, an official notice citing noncompliance with community infrastructure and property aesthetics. The document was a labyrinth of legal jargon designed to intimidate and assert the HOA's authority over his private domain. Before Ethan could fully digest the contents, he stepped outside to find Kerren waiting at the fence line. Standing with her arms folded and a smug expression, she greeted him crisply. "Good morning, Ethan. I trust you've read the notice? Remember, the rules apply to everyone, and we must maintain community standards." Her tone left no room for debate. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he replied, "Kerren, cutting my water line or meddling with my property is not a minor infraction. My ranch is my livelihood, and your arbitrary fines are nothing more than bullying tactics." His voice was steady, a clear declaration that he would not be cowed by her dictatorial demands. Unwavering, Kerren retorted, "It is my duty to enforce the HOA guidelines. Your property does not meet the standards, and if you do not comply, further actions will be taken." With that, she turned on her heel and strode away, leaving Ethan seething. Later that morning, while Ethan was inspecting the boundaries of his property and checking the damaged water line, a nondescript van pulled up near his fence. Two inspectors, clad in official uniforms and armed with clipboards, emerged. They began measuring the damaged pipe, snapping photographs of every detail, and jotting down notes as if his critical infrastructure were nothing more than a minor code violation. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized the extent of the intrusion. Determined not to be reduced to a silent victim, he began documenting everything. He snapped photos of the inspectors in action, recorded snippets of their conversations, and meticulously noted the time and details of their visit. His phone became a tool of resistance, a way to capture the overreach in irrefutable evidence. That afternoon, as the inspectors finally left and the silence of the ranch returned, Ethan retreated to the barn's cramped office. Surrounded by yellowed papers and family photographs, he drafted a formal complaint to the county zoning office. In his letter, he cited long-established agricultural exemptions and historical preservation statutes that guaranteed his right to manage his property without undue interference. His complaint was both a legal challenge and a personal manifesto against an HOA that sought to dictate the terms of his life. Word of the incident spread quickly through Maple Hollow. At local feed stores and in hushed conversations at community gatherings, neighbors discussed the recent fine and the invasive inspection. Even those who had once tolerated Kerren's strict rules began to murmur about the fairness of her tactics. The community was slowly awakening to the idea that their rights were being trampled in the name of order. That evening, as twilight descended and the cicadas began their nightly chorus, Kerren returned to Ethan's property. Under the single glow of a porch light, she delivered a new ultimatum. "You have 48 hours to restore your water line and bring your property into compliance, Ethan. Failure to do so will result in additional fines and enforcement actions." Her voice was cold, leaving no room for negotiation. Ethan's response was calm but resolute. "I will repair my water line when I see fit, and I will not be bullied into submission by arbitrary rules." As he shut the door behind him, he felt the weight of the day's events settle in. This was only the beginning of a long, bitter struggle, a struggle for his rights, his legacy, and his freedom to run his ranch without interference. In the days that followed the water line debacle, the conflict on Ethan's ranch escalated from isolated fines to a full-scale campaign of intimidation. The inspector's intrusion was merely the opening salvo in what soon became a relentless assault on his property. Neighbors began whispering about similar abuses, the arbitrary fines, the unannounced inspections, and even tales of trespassing that disrupted their daily lives. One gray afternoon, while Ethan was repairing a section of his fence near the boundary, his longtime friend and neighboring rancher, Tom, pulled up beside him in his pickup. "Ethan," Tom said in a low, urgent tone, "you're not alone. I've heard that Kerren's been cutting water lines and issuing fines left and right. Some say the money is going into a secret fund for her personal projects. People are scared, but they're also getting fed up." Tom's words resonated deeply with Ethan. What had begun as a personal attack was revealing itself as part of a larger pattern of corruption and abuse of power by the HOA. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Ethan began a covert investigation. He made discreet trips to the county clerk's office to scrutinize HOA records, attended board meetings incognito, and even recorded whispered conversations among disgruntled homeowners. Every piece of evidence he gathered painted a damning picture. Kerren's methods were not about community improvement. They were about consolidating power and enriching herself at the expense of property owners. One stormy night, as rain pounded on the tin roof of his barn, Ethan pored over photocopies of financial ledgers and anonymous notes. He compiled a detailed dossier that documented irregularities in the HOA's finances, mysterious transfers, forged documents, and inexplicable deductions from fines. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Kerren was exploiting the rules to maintain her stranglehold on the community. Word of Ethan's investigation began to spread. At a secret meeting held in the back room of a local feed store, several frustrated homeowners recounted their own experiences with the HOA's overreach. An elderly rancher tearfully described how a minor discrepancy in the placement of his windmill had resulted in a crippling fine, while another admitted he had been forced to pay voluntary contributions that disappeared into an unaccountable fund. The collective outrage was palpable, and Ethan's resolve only grew stronger. Determined to protect his ranch and expose the corruption, Ethan installed additional security cameras along the perimeter of his property. Every instance of trespassing, every unannounced inspection was recorded in high definition. His phone and notebook became his constant companions, capturing details that would one day serve as irrefutable evidence in his fight for justice. As the days passed, Kerren's tactics grew even more draconian. In a series of curt, official letters, she threatened that any further noncompliance would result in the seizure of property rights. Rumors began to circulate that the HOA might even resort to using legal force to reclaim portions of privately owned land deemed unsightly or nonconforming. The community trembled under these threats, and Ethan knew that his battle was about more than just one water line. It was about the fundamental right to manage one's own property. Late one evening, as thunder rolled over the fields and lightning illuminated the dark skies, Ethan reviewed his dossier one more time. He realized that if he did not act soon, the HOA's abuses would only worsen, and the community would lose more of its autonomy. With determination burning in his eyes, he resolved to take his evidence public. He reached out to local journalists, handing over copies of the financial records, photos of the inspectors, and recordings of conversations that revealed the true extent of the corruption. As the sound of the storm faded into the night, Ethan stood outside his ranch, gazing out over the land that had been so ruthlessly targeted. He vowed that he would not allow the HOA, and Kerren in particular, to trample on his legacy any longer. The fight for his property, for his rights, was just beginning. The mounting pressure reached a boiling point one sweltering morning when Ethan arrived at his ranch only to discover the unthinkable. His once thriving fields of crops were in disarray. In the early light, he noticed charred patches where his corn and soybeans once stood tall. The unmistakable scent of smoke filled the air, a sign that someone had deliberately set fire to his crops. As he rushed toward the affected area, his heart sank. The evidence was clear. Someone had burned his crops out of spite. Within minutes, a security camera mounted on his barn captured a shocking scene. The footage revealed a shadowy figure, later identified as none other than Kerren, carefully maneuvering near the field with what appeared to be an accelerant. Moments later, flames erupted, consuming several rows of Ethan's meticulously tended crops. The act was calculated and spiteful, a final, destructive power play by the HOA enforcer. Furious and heartbroken, Ethan immediately gathered the evidence. He downloaded the video footage from his security cameras and took high-resolution snapshots of the burning field. The images were devastating. His hard-earned legacy reduced to smoldering ash by an act of vandalism. This wasn't a mere accident or a misguided attempt at improvement. It was an outright attack on his livelihood. Determined to strike back, Ethan organized a meeting with his neighbors and fellow ranchers. At the next HOA meeting, a crowded hall filled with tense faces and murmurs of discontent, Ethan took the stage with a file of damning evidence. He began by recounting the timeline of events, the fines, the intrusive inspections, and finally, the deliberate burning of his crops. With every word, his voice grew steadier, more resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "my ranch is more than just land. It is the legacy of my family and the heart of our community. Kerren's actions are not only illegal, they are an attack on everything we hold dear." He then played the security footage for the assembled crowd. The video, showing Kerren's deliberate actions and the ensuing blaze, left the room in stunned silence. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience as the undeniable proof of her wrongdoing was laid bare. Kerren, standing at the back of the room, attempted to interject. "This is all circumstantial," she cried, but her voice was drowned out by the collective outrage of the community. The board members exchanged uneasy glances as Ethan methodically laid out his case. Photographs of burned crops, eyewitness testimonies, and detailed logs of every incident. It was clear that Kerren's abuse of power had crossed a line. Emboldened by the overwhelming support of his neighbors, Ethan announced that he would be taking legal action. "I'm not only suing for the damages. I'm going to bill you for every single drop of water and every kernel of crop lost due to your malicious actions," he declared. His words, both a promise and a challenge, resonated deeply in the packed room. It was a turning point. The community had finally seen the extent of the HOA's corruption and was ready to stand up. As the meeting adjourned, the buzz of conversation was unmistakable. Homeowners and ranchers, once cowed into silence, were now speaking openly about the need to reclaim their rights. Ethan's presentation had ignited a spark of rebellion that could not be ignored. That evening, as Ethan walked the perimeter of his now scarred field, he felt both the pain of loss and the strength of resolve. His ranch had been violated, but the evidence of that violation would serve as the cornerstone of his fight for justice. Every burned stalk, every charred remnant, was a testament to the lengths Kerren would go to impose her will, and the community's determination to fight back. Ethan knew that Kerren's next move was coming, and he was ready. With his security cameras, his detailed logs, and the support of a community awakened to injustice, he prepared to take the battle to the next level. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only determine the fate of his ranch, but would also redefine the power dynamics of the entire neighborhood. Reeling from the public outrage and the damning evidence of her latest act of vandalism, Kerren was desperate to regain control. In a final bid to salvage her authority, she decided to take matters into her own hands once again. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, Kerren gathered a small group of loyal HOA enforcers and, armed with crude tools, returned to Ethan's ranch. Her objective was clear: to intimidate Ethan further and send a message that the HOA's power was absolute. Under the dim glow of a single security light, Kerren and her entourage crept toward the remains of the burned crop field. Their plan was to erase the evidence of the fire by setting additional fires to cleanse the area and create confusion, and to disrupt any attempt by Ethan to document the damage. However, what they did not count on was Ethan's unwavering vigilance. Over the past weeks, he had upgraded his security system, strategically placing high-definition cameras around the perimeter of his property. As Kerren's team began their clandestine operation, one of the cameras picked up every move. In real time, Ethan watched the feed from his tablet, his eyes narrowing as he saw Kerren approach the field with a can of accelerant in hand. Before she could act, the sound of a loud alarm blared out, a pre-programmed alert triggered by motion sensors along the fence. Startled, Kerren hesitated for just a moment. That was all Ethan needed. With swift precision, the security cameras captured every detail: Kerren's frantic expressions, the hurried fumbling with the canister, and the desperate shouts as she realized she was being recorded. The footage was clear and undeniable. Within minutes, Ethan had downloaded the video, the evidence of her latest desperate act firmly in his hands. The following day, at the next HOA meeting, Ethan arrived armed with his damning evidence. In a packed town hall filled with anxious homeowners and silent board members, he took to the stage once again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and resolute, "what you are about to see is not an accident. It's not a misunderstanding, it's deliberate vandalism." He then played the security footage on a large screen. The room fell deathly silent as Kerren's desperate actions were exposed for all to see. The video showed her, can in hand, stumbling and shouting in anguish as the accelerant spilled, and the unmistakable sound of her screams echoed through the speakers. Kerren attempted to protest, shouting, "That footage is edited. You're blowing this out of proportion." But her words were drowned out by the murmurs and gasps of the assembled crowd. The evidence was irrefutable. Every frame was a testament to her willingness to stoop to criminal levels of intimidation to maintain her authority. In a final futile attempt to deflect blame, Kerren claimed that her actions were a misguided effort to clean up the area for the betterment of the community. "I was trying to improve the aesthetics," she insisted, her voice trembling. But Ethan was quick to counter. "Improvement does not come at the expense of someone's livelihood," he declared. "My crops, the very foundation of my ranch, were deliberately burned. And now, I have every piece of evidence to hold you accountable." By the close of the meeting, it was clear that Kerren's desperate move had backfired completely. The community's support for Ethan had reached a fever pitch, and every piece of evidence further dismantled her credibility. Kerren's days of unchecked authority were numbered, and the legal and public backlash was imminent. That evening, as Ethan sat on his porch reviewing the footage one last time, he felt a mix of sorrow and satisfaction. His ranch had suffered a tremendous loss, but the evidence he had gathered would ensure that justice was served. Kerren's final, desperate act had sealed her fate, and Ethan vowed that he would pursue every legal avenue to reclaim what was rightfully his. In the wake of Kerren's exposed misdeeds and the overwhelming public outcry, the community of Maple Hollow began to mobilize. What had once been a quiet neighborhood now thrummed with collective anger and determination to reclaim their rights. Homeowners and ranchers, emboldened by Ethan's courage and the irrefutable evidence against Kerren, organized protests, town hall meetings, and public forums to demand accountability. At a particularly charged meeting held at the local civic center, long-suffering residents recounted years of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and the personal toll of Kerren's tyrannical rule. Stories poured out of ruined crops, drained water lines, and the fear of constant intrusion. As one by one, community members testified to their hardships, the atmosphere grew electric with solidarity and defiance. Under mounting pressure, the HOA board found itself isolated. In a dramatic, historic vote broadcast live to the entire community, the board members, many of whom had grown disillusioned with Kerren's leadership, unanimously voted to remove her from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with thunderous applause, tears of relief, and a palpable sense of liberation among the assembled homeowners. Simultaneously, local authorities announced an independent investigation into the HOA's practices. Auditors unearthed a tangled web of misappropriated funds, forged documents, and a systematic pattern of extortion that had enriched a select few at the expense of the community. Headlines in the local newspapers blared declarations like "HOA tyranny toppled" and "Community triumph over corruption," and the public reveled in the newfound hope. For Ethan, the removal of Kerren was both a personal and symbolic victory. His lawsuit for damages, and his plan to bill for every drop of loss caused by her destructive acts, had become a beacon of resistance. The evidence he had so painstakingly gathered was now the cornerstone of a larger movement that sought to restore fairness and respect for individual property rights. In the weeks that followed, a reformed HOA was established under new leadership, one committed to transparency, accountability, and the protection of every homeowner's rights. Neighbors who had long lived in fear began speaking openly about their aspirations for a community governed not by arbitrary edicts, but by fairness and mutual respect. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and bathed Maple Hollow in a warm, golden glow, Ethan would sit on his porch with a cup of strong coffee. He watched as the community slowly healed, as laughter replaced tension, and as the scars of oppression began to fade. His ranch, though marred by the recent violence, now stood as a monument to resilience, a living testament to the power of standing up for one's rights. Kerren's downfall was swift and public. Her assets were frozen, her personal bank account scrutinized, and soon her once feared reputation was reduced to a cautionary tale. The very authority she had wielded to intimidate others had turned against her, and her public humiliation was complete. With the community united against the abuses of the old HOA, legal authorities moved decisively to dismantle the corrupt institution. Bolstered by Ethan's comprehensive dossier, which included photographs, video footage of Kerren's criminal acts, and detailed logs of every violation, the county launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. The inquiry revealed a labyrinth of financial misappropriations, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had exploited homeowners for years. A series of class action lawsuits was swiftly filed on behalf of the affected residents. In a landmark courtroom session, a judge pored over pages of indisputable evidence, delivering a verdict that sent shockwaves through Maple Hollow. The HOA was to be dissolved immediately, its assets frozen pending further legal action, and its leadership held accountable for their crimes. The state attorney general even established an independent task force to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations, ensuring that such tyranny would never again take root. Local media exploded with the story. Headlines blared HOA tyranny dismantled, and community triumph over corruption, and televised reports captured the jubilant reactions of homeowners who had long suffered under arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. Ethan's groundbreaking lawsuit, demanding compensation for the ruined crops and every dollar lost due to Kerren's malicious actions, became a rallying cry for property owners everywhere. The legal verdict was a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law, and that collective action could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Former board members were subjected to intense scrutiny, and several faced criminal charges for their complicity in the corruption. The dissolution of the old HOA marked not only the end of an era, but the beginning of a new model for community governance, one built on transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. As the legal storm subsided and the corrupt HOA was dismantled, Kerren Miller's personal world began to crumble in a series of humiliating reversals. Once the unyielding enforcer of arbitrary rules, she was now exposed as a tyrant whose authority was based on intimidation and greed. Public scrutiny intensified as evidence of her criminal actions, especially the deliberate burning of crops, was paraded in courtrooms and splashed across local media. Her bank accounts were frozen, and assets that had once symbolized her supposed power were seized to cover the fines levied against the HOA. In a final bitter twist, Kerren was forced to resign in a public spectacle that left her reputation in tatters. Neighbors whispered about her fall from grace, and gossip spread like wildfire. Her lavish lifestyle had been built on the backs of innocent property owners, and now the tables had turned. The ultimate irony came when Kerren, desperate to salvage her career, was offered a low-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a body that prided itself on strict adherence to rules she had once enforced with reckless abandon. One crisp morning, as Ethan drove past a modest office building where Kerren now worked in plain, unremarkable attire, he couldn't help but smile and murmur under his breath, "I hope you like following the rules." That wry comment, laden with bitter satisfaction, quickly became the talk of the town, a final, poetic testament to her fall from power. Interviews with former board members and once intimidated residents painted a unanimous picture. Kerren's reign of terror was over. Her personal collapse had become a powerful symbol of accountability, a reminder that unchecked authority ultimately crumbles when held accountable by the collective will of a united community. For Ethan, witnessing Kerren's downfall was a vindication of everything he had fought for. His ranch, though scarred by the conflict, stood as a testament to resilience and the triumph of justice over tyranny. Every burned crop, every dollar lost, was now part of a larger story, a story that would be told for generations about the day the community rose up to reclaim its rights. In the months following the dismantling of the corrupt HOA and Kerren's public collapse, the community of Maple Hollow began to heal. The oppressive shadow of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections receded, replaced by a renewed sense of unity and empowerment. Ethan's ranch, with its once scarred fields now slowly returning to life, stood as a proud symbol of resilience and independence. At a celebratory community picnic held on a bright autumn afternoon, neighbors gathered to mark the dawn of a new era. Laughter filled the air as families shared hearty meals. Children played freely in the open fields, and the spirit of solidarity was palpable. A local artist unveiled a humorous mural depicting a red-faced Kerren amid a backdrop of charred crops and security cameras, a final, irreverent mic drop on her reign of terror. Seated on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Ethan watched the festivities with quiet satisfaction. The painful memories of burned crops and relentless harassment had given way to hope, unity, and a sense of justice, well served. When a longtime friend approached him with a mock HOA violation notice for excessive crop destruction and trespassing of decency, Ethan simply grinned and replied, "They really tried." In that serene moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the valley in hues of gold and pink, the legacy of Kerren's tyranny faded into memory. The community had reclaimed its rights and restored the integrity of its cherished properties. Ethan's steadfast fight, the meticulously gathered evidence, and his refusal to be cowed had set a powerful precedent. That true power lies not in arbitrary control, but in the courage to stand up for one's home. Fade to black.